The security guard ripped the badge off her chest and let it fall onto the tile. They thought she was just another nurse, replaceable, quiet enough to erase without questions. She didn't flinch. She didn't speak, but her fingers stayed wrapped around the doorknob. Her breath was shallow. The elevator behind her opened, and the person who stepped out didn't speak either. But what they held in their hand changed everything. Before we dive in, take a moment. Tell us where you're watching from in the comments. And if justice matters to you, if quiet strength speaks louder than power, tap like and subscribe, because tomorrow's episode isn't just powerful. It's the revenge you've been waiting for. She was summoned to HR without a time slot, without a reason, without a trace of warning. The receptionist avoided eye contact as she walked by. The hallway felt colder than usual. When she entered the room, 3 people were already seated. The head of human resources, the hospital's legal liaison, and someone from administration she had never seen before. No greetings, no small talk. Just a closed file on the table and a cup of water that no one offered. The head of HR cleared his throat and spoke without looking up. Your position has been terminated, effective immediately. She asked why. The response was clipped, rehearsed. We received a complaint about your conduct on the floor. To its sensitive nature, in our policy on staff safety, we have to act swiftly. She blinked once. What conduct? No one answered. The liaison leaned in. You have 5 minutes to gather personal items. You'll be escorted out by security. Her hands remained on her lap. The silence in the room wasn't awkward. It was engineered. No details, no paperwork, no mention of what day, what shift, or what incident. She hadn't been warned. She hadn't been reviewed. Just removed, like a risk. When she stood, no one said goodbye. She exited the room as calmly as she had entered. But outside that door, a young intern dropped the folder he was carrying when he saw her. A patient sitting nearby gasped. Nurses, down the hall, paused. One whispered. She didn't even raise her voice. Before she could reach the locker room, a security guard met her halfway. You'll be escorted, he said, like she didn't know. His tone wasn't harsh. It was indifferent. That was worse. She walked through the halls in silence. Past the ICU, where she had held hands with dying men and women. Past the recovery wing, where new mothers once hugged her with tears in their eyes. Past the pediatric ward where kids used to pull her sleeve. Just a smile. Now the air tasted different. Like metal and shame. The guard didn't touch her, but he didn't need to. His presence said it all. As she stepped outside, the sun was too bright. Not warm, just blinding. Like even the sky was trying to erase her, but she didn't squint. She stood still, then walked. Not away, just forward. By the next morning, the story had changed. She hadn't just been fired. She had been escorted out for stealing medication. That was the first version. By noon, the theft had escalated to an overdose incident. By afternoon, someone whispered that she'd attacked a patient. None of it was written down. No formal charges. No documentation. Just hallway talk spreading like a virus. Every lie sharper than the last. When she walked into the pharmacy to pick up a refill, the technician paused before speaking. They said, you can't use this facility anymore. Orders from the top. She didn't argue. She turned, walked out. Across the street, 2 junior nurses crossed quickly when they saw her. One of them giggled nervously. The other muttered, I heard she pushed someone in the stairwell. At home, her phone buzzed twice. A text from an old colleague. What did you do? She didn't reply. Instead, she called HR. She asked for a formal termination letter. They told her it was still being finalized. Then the call ended. That night, as she scrolled through the hospital's staff site, her profile photo was gone. No trace of her department. No trace of her training, certifications, patient commendations, or the leadership role she'd quietly held for 3 years. Even internal memos she had authored had been scrubbed. She was being erased. She emailed the union. Their reply came within minutes. You were not listed as a dues-paying member. Unfortunately, we cannot assist. Which was strange. She'd seen the deductions on her paychecks for years. At midnight, her license portal showed a pending flag. The reason box was blank. She refreshed it twice. Still blank. Still flagged. A doctor she had once assisted sent her a message with no greeting. Just a question. Why didn't you tell me the real reason you were fired? She stared at it, then deleted it. The next morning, as she approached the hospital lobby to request her last paycheck, a janitor who worked the night shift passed by and said without stopping, you didn't hear this from me, but someone in admin said it's personal. They're not done with you. She stopped walking, watched the automatic doors slide shut, and realized something deeper than defamation was happening. This wasn't just a personal attack. It was institutional, targeted, designed to isolate her, discredit her, and bury her name before she could even speak. She didn't sleep that night. The noise in her head was louder than traffic and less honest than the whispers she heard on the hospital floor. By sunrise, she was already dressed, seated at the kitchen table with a legal pad, a black pen, and a list of names only she could recognize. First, she called former patients, 5 didn't answer. 2 numbers had been disconnected. But one elderly woman, a stroke survivor she had once cared for during a difficult rehab, remembered her instantly. "You saved my life. What's going on? I heard something strange." The woman offered to write a letter, but even that felt too thin against what was being done to her. She emailed former colleagues who had left the hospital years ago, asking for any documentation, any internal memos, anything they had saved that mentioned her. 2 responded with sympathy. One forwarded her an old staff evaluation from 3 years ago that had praised her leadership and professionalism. But when she checked her official HR file through the employee portal, the evaluation was gone. Deleted. She knew because she had written evaluations herself. They couldn't vanish, unless someone at admin level removed them. Later that day, she walked back toward the hospital but did not enter. She stood across the street with a notebook and watched who went in and out. At lunch hour, she spotted a janitor she recognized, the one who always cleaned the East Wing. She crossed the street, walked beside him without speaking. He nodded, slowly, and said, "You're not the first. I've seen them do this. They pick someone, push them out, spread dirt, then act like it never happened." She asked why. He shook his head. "Wrong color, wrong kind of quiet. And they say you made someone look bad in front of a donor." She froze. She knew who, a senior administrator who had misquoted a protocol during a presentation, and she had corrected him gently but in front of 2 board observers. That had been 3 months ago. The janitor leaned closer. "He's the one who bragged that you were handled." She wrote the name in her notebook, then circled it, then underlined it. That night, as she pored over the hospital's public filings, she found something else. A scheduled board vote from 4 months earlier, changing internal policy around personnel removal. It allowed executives to bypass progressive discipline for reputational risk, a vague phrase inserted quietly. She printed the document. At the bottom, she saw the signature of the administrator she had corrected. That was when the pattern started to click. This wasn't random, it was coordinated, it was systemic. And she wasn't the only one. A few clicks later, she found an old news article about a black male nurse from the same hospital who had vanished from records after a dispute. No formal complaints. No lawsuits, just gone. Erased. She remembered his name. Remembered that no one ever said goodbye to him either. And now, sitting at her kitchen table again, staring at her notes, her hands shook for the first time, not because she was afraid of losing everything, but because she realized she might already be the last one who could speak without being silenced. She returned to the hospital not as staff, not as a guest, but as someone holding a letter sealed in a plain white envelope. Inside was her official appeal, addressed to the hospital's executive committee, typed cleanly with no emotion, only facts. As she approached the entrance, her steps were calm but deliberate. The moment she passed the revolving doors, the security guard on shift narrowed his eyes and reached for his radio. She didn't stop. She walked toward the front desk, placed the envelope down, and asked the clerk to deliver it directly to the executive office. The woman behind the desk hesitated, then looked up slowly. "Are you supposed to be here?" she asked. The question wasn't about policy, it was about position. She replied with one sentence. "I am delivering this to the people who took mine." Before the clerk could respond, a large man in a hospital badge stepped between them. The head of surgical administration. His voice carried. "You're trespassing. If you don't leave, we'll call the police." Her response was silence. But that silence made others turn. 2 nurses at the corner pretended not to look, but shifted closer. A patient in a wheelchair blinked hard, sensing something had shifted. In the air, the administrator leaned in, lowering his voice but sharpening his tone. "You're not welcome here. You're nothing but a distraction now." Still, she did not speak. She turned slightly, enough to see the young intern from earlier, standing near the elevators, watching, holding a chart in his hands. His lips didn't move, but his eyes said everything: fear, recognition, regret. The administrator snatched the envelope from the desk and snapped. "This will be reviewed and discarded." She finally spoke, just one word: "Photocopy." He paused. "What? I already made one," she said, and walked toward the exit. The security guard followed her all the way out. When the doors shut behind her, she stood on the sidewalk, not looking back. Her chest didn't rise with victory. It barely moved at all, but the paper in his hand was real, and it had her name, and it was now inside the building. They tried to erase her from Eva DeFay act of throwing it away. The act of throwing it away would have to be logged. Someone would see it, or at least know that it existed, and the act of trying to hide it might end up being the very proof she needed. Later that evening, she sat alone in the corner booth of a small diner 3 blocks from the hospital. A cup of untouched coffee in front of her, and a folded envelope of documents under her palm. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead was the only sound steady enough to think through. She had printed policies, archived board updates, and a copy of her missing evaluation. But she knew paperwork wasn't enough. Not anymore. Not when the story they were pushing had already poisoned the halls she once walked daily. The truth would need more than proof. It would need exposure. That was when she received the message. It came from a hospital email, but not one she recognized. No name, just 6 words. Meet me outside West Entrance tonight. At first, she ignored it. Then she checked the sender's signature hidden in the metadata. It belonged to a current intern, one she vaguely remembered seeing near the elevators. Weeks before, she waited, then walked. The west entrance of the hospital was quiet at night. It was where deliveries came in, where custodians and maintenance workers stepped out for their smoke breaks. She stood under the loading bay lights until a slim figure approached in a hoodie, eyes darting side to side. He didn't speak until they were close. "I've seen the pattern," he said. 3 nurses of color, 2 techs. They all left with no reason. She asked him how he knew. He held up his phone and showed a spreadsheet. Department logs, termination dates, performance scores. She scanned it quickly. All names tied to excellent reviews, all removals labeled internal discretion. She asked why he made it. He whispered, "Because I'm next." She told him to be careful. He replied, "I already sent it to a lawyer. If I disappear, someone will talk." As he walked away, he added one more thing. They use the word integrity a lot in meetings, but they whisper the word image even louder. That night, she highlighted every line in her notes where staff were targeted after raising concerns or challenging authority. One name kept repeating. The same administrator she had corrected in front of a donor. The one who had signed the policy revision. And then she found it. A series of board meeting recordings from 2 years ago uploaded to the hospital's public channel. One in particular caught her attention. In it, the same administrator argued for restructuring staff evaluation access, citing potential manipulation by minority hires trying to weaponize documentation. The room laughed. No one objected. The clip was 34 seconds long, but it was enough. She downloaded it and stored it in 5 different drives. Then she printed his words on a single sheet of paper and placed it next to her own missing records. This wasn't a personal feud, it was policy. It was protected, and now it was visible. 2 days later, she returned home to find her front door slightly ajar. Nothing was broken. Nothing was stolen, but the framed license on her living room had been removed and left on the kitchen table, face down. She didn't scream. She checked every window, every lock. Everything else was untouched. But someone had been inside. Someone who knew exactly what to touch. That evening, an envelope with no return address was pushed through her mailbox. Inside was a printed cease and desist letter claiming defamation against hospital administration. The letter was unsigned, unofficial, filled with legal phrasing but no legal grounding. Still, it sent a message. Stop digging, or suffer the consequences. The next day, she received a call from a community health clinic where she volunteered twice a month. The voice on the other end was nervous. They said the clinic would no longer need her services due to reputational concerns. She asked what concerns. They didn't explain. They just apologized and ended the call. Her world was shrinking. Quietly, deliberately, she called to friends, both former colleagues. One didn't answer. The other picked up but hesitated before speaking. "I just don't want to get involved," she said. "They're saying you brought this on yourself." The line went silent. That night, she sat by the window, watching the street, lights off, her phone off, her voice quiet, but the rage inside her was loud. Louder than it had ever been, because she wasn't being erased by accident. They were making an example out of her, using fear, silence, and isolation as weapons. And they had done it before. But this time, they left something behind. A fingerprint, a pressure point, a mistake. She returned to her files, her notes, her audio clips, her copy of the altered policy, and the intern's spreadsheet. One by one, she began connecting dots. Names, dates, removals, complaints filed but never acknowledged. Repeated phrases used in each case, a pattern too exact to be coincidence. Then she opened her front door, stood in the hallway, and placed her hand on the frame. She looked at the spot where the hinges were bent, just slightly. Whoever entered had a key, or a copy, which meant someone had access to her personnel records, her address, her schedule, her habits. It wasn't just retaliation, it was invasion. And whoever they weren't finished yet. 3 days later, a journalist reached out. She had seen a screen-recorded clip of the hospital board meeting floating anonymously on social media, and it led her to the former nurse's name. The journalist worked for a mid-sized regional outlet, not national but respected, and said she wanted to verify what she saw before publishing. They met in a neutral space, a small cafe behind a bookstore, quiet and out of sight. The journalist brought her own recorder and a printed copy of the spreadsheet the intern had compiled. For 3 hours, they went through every incident, every missing record, every name that had disappeared from the system. The nurse spoke clearly, slowly, without anger, only certainty. She showed the original evaluation report. She shared the new internal policy change with the administrator's signature. She played the audio of the board member justifying removals to maintain the hospital's image. When it was over, the journalist leaned back and said, "This isn't just a story. This is a blueprint for how they bury people." 2 days later, the article was published. It didn't name names, but detailed the patterns, the internal policy shifts, the disappearing records, and the racial bias embedded in administrative actions. It featured a quote from the nurse, anonymous but unmistakable to anyone who knew. Her piece gained traction quickly. By evening, local activists had shared it, and by morning, it hit national attention. A trending hashtag surfaced, demanding answers from the hospital. Patients began commenting on review sites. Nurses reposted fragments of the article with phrases like "This happened to me too, and I remember her." The hospital released a statement denying the allegations and promising a full internal review. The nurse sat in her kitchen watching the story unfold and, for the first time in weeks, allowed herself a moment of relief. Then the journalist called. Her voice was low, tight. "They terminated me. No warning. Said my work violated ethical guidelines." There was a pause. "They knew I met with you. Someone leaked our conversation." The nurse didn't speak. Her eyes locked on the news alert that popped up seconds later. The hospital had announced it was launching a defamation lawsuit against the publication. The article was pulled offline. The social media posts began disappearing. Comments stopped. Accounts were suspended. And the silence came back, faster than before. She sat perfectly still as her phone screen went black. The victory had been real, but it had never been allowed to last. The next morning, her name appeared in an anonymous online forum, accompanied by a falsified patient complaint. It claimed she had once administered the wrong dosage to a child in recovery, nearly killing them. There was no date, no hospital name, no signature, just a well-written paragraph laced with emotional details that felt real enough to stick. Within hours, it was reposted across several platforms. Commenters asked how she was ever licensed in the first place. Others called for her arrest. A few used her photo from an old staff bulletin and paired it with the word danger in bold red letters. She tried to report the posts. Some were taken down. Most were not. That afternoon, her phone rang. It was a small wellness center where she occasionally offered part-time patient counseling. The director apologized. "We need to let you go. Our board received complaints. We can't risk the clinic's reputation." She didn't ask what kind of complaints. She already knew. She thanked the director for the opportunity and ended the call. That night, she walked into a grocery store to buy bread and toothpaste. As she stood in the checkout line, a man behind her stared at her name on the debit card. His voice wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to cut through the air. "You're that nurse, the one who hurt that kid." She turned to face him, expression steady, but her hands trembled just slightly as she bagged her items and left. Outside the store, under a flickering light, she found a folded piece of paper tucked under her windshield wiper. It was printed, with one line, "You think you're safe just because you're quiet." She sat in the car for a long time before starting the engine. When she got home, there was an envelope on her doorstep. It wasn't mailed. Inside was a lawsuit notice, not from the hospital directly, but from a private citizen claiming defamation. Citing her anonymous quote in the now removed article, the claim was baseless, but it had enough formatting and legal stamps to scare most people into silence. She didn't cry. She didn't panic. She read every line, memorized the name of the filing attorney, then placed the document beside all the others. This wasn't random cruelty. It was public control. Strip away her voice, then punish her for having spoken. If anyone else had been watching her story, this moment would seem like the end. But she knew better. This wasn't the end, it was the middle of something deeper, something they hadn't calculated. She had nothing left for them to take, and that made her the most dangerous kind of quiet. She returned to the hospital just after sunrise, wearing the same gray coat she had been escorted out in weeks before. No bag, no phone, no folder, just a single envelope in her hand. The security guard at the door recognized her and moved to intercept, but she kept walking. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't explain herself. She simply kept walking until she reached the administrative wing and stepped into the glass conference room, where the executive staff had just begun their morning meeting. No one moved at first. A few stood, confused, then tense. The head of operations began to speak, but she placed the envelope on the table in front of him without a word. He opened it. Inside was a notarized ownership document, signed and filed with the state, showing her as the silent majority stakeholder of the hospital's founding trust. 51%. Her name was not on their HR system. It was not on their internal board list, but it was on the original Articles of Establishment, filed 7 years earlier when the hospital had undergone a major expansion and required private equity from undisclosed donors. She had been that donor. She had chosen to remain anonymous, to work within the system she helped build, without hierarchy or praise. But now her silence had been mistaken for powerlessness. And so she spoke, not with volume, but with finality. She stated the clause that allowed her to appear without notice. She cited the section that gave her immediate access to all board documentation and personnel decisions. Then she walked out. No threats, no delay. Just the truth, laid bare in legal ink. By noon, word had reached every wing. The woman they had laughed at, fired, erased, defamed, and warned to stay quiet had just revealed herself as the very foundation beneath their feet. In the staff lounge, a nurse dropped her coffee. In the ICU, a tech stared at his screen without blinking. On the fourth floor, a junior administrator called legal and whispered, "What do we do now?" But there was no script for what came next, because everything they had done, every document they had altered, every lie they had whispered, had been done to someone who never needed to raise her voice to own the room. The hospital board held an emergency meeting that evening. No press, no notice. Just 6 members seated in a locked room behind dark-tinted glass, pacing and murmuring in tones that barely concealed their panic. She had made her move, but they were not ready to concede. Not yet. One of them, the same senior administrator she had corrected months earlier, proposed a vote to temporarily suspend her ownership rights, pending a psychiatric review. Another suggested invoking the emergency override clause buried in the internal bylaws, one that had never been used but could technically freeze stakeholder authority for up to 9 days under a claim of reputational threat to the institution. They didn't care if it was legal. They cared if it could stall her. That same evening, a memo was circulated to all department heads, stating that due to recent developments involving internal litigation, all staff were prohibited from engaging in any communication with suspended individuals, even if previously employed. By morning, her email was blocked. Her staff ID was still inactive. She attempted to access the system through legal channels, but the login routes had been rerouted under a temporary lock. A message appeared on the screen stating that her credentials were under audit. Meanwhile, the board's legal team filed a motion to investigate her mental stability, citing sudden behavior shifts, erratic communications, and unprofessional conduct within the last 30 days. No dates were given, no examples. Just a string of vague accusations buried under the language of compliance and protocol. That afternoon, 2 private security agents arrived at the hospital. Their presence was explained as a precaution due to recent disruptions, but their instructions were clear. She was not to enter the board level, not to speak to staff, not to access digital records until further notice. Word spread quickly. Staff whispered in break rooms. No one said her name aloud, but everyone knew what was happening. Some were afraid, others were ashamed. Most were silent. That silence was the board's weapon of choice. They had always relied on silence. When a junior nurse tried to speak up in a group chat, her message disappeared within seconds. Her access was revoked shortly after. Someone else shared a screenshot of the internal email, but by nightfall, it too had vanished. The board's retaliation was not just legal, it was strategic. It was digital, it was psychological, and most of all, it was fast. But they had miscalculated one thing. She didn't need their permission to exist, and she didn't need access. To prove what was already written, the documents, the recordings, the contracts, the policies were already backed up. What they had tried to erase had already been preserved. They could delay her, but they could not undo her. The next morning, the silence began to crack. A notification appeared in her inbox from a hidden address containing a single file. It was an internal memo written by one of the hospital's senior financial officers, marked confidential. The memo outlined discrepancies in expense reporting related to legal fees that had been quietly rebated from patient care budgets to cover ongoing retaliation efforts. Attached were timestamps, emails, and routing approvals signed by multiple board members. The sender had no name, only a line typed at the bottom. Someone is watching too. That same afternoon, the young intern who had first shared the spreadsheet reappeared. He had been silent for weeks, but now stood on the hospital steps holding a flash drive and a folded piece of cardboard with one word written in thick black. Marker, patterns. He handed the drive to a group of journalists waiting nearby. No speech, no explanation, just walked away. Inside the drive were transcripts, archived calendar logs, and summaries of multiple HR removals, all showing racial disparities masked as professional concerns. By the end of the day, 3 former patients posted video testimonials saying she was the only nurse who had treated them with dignity when no one else would. One video reached over 100,000 views in less than 8 hours. Across the street from the hospital, a small group of protesters appeared, holding signs that read "Erased but not gone" and "Protect the ones who heal." They weren't loud, they weren't many, but they didn't leave. The hospital released another vague statement about privacy and internal matters. It did nothing. The next morning, an older man walked into her apartment lobby and waited until she stepped off the elevator. He removed his hat and introduced himself as one of the original co-founders of the hospital before the expansion. He said he had seen what happened. He said he had walked away years ago when money replaced mission. Then he handed her a binder. Inside was a sealed affidavit from the original legal filings that confirmed her silent majority role and the intention of that role to act as a final safeguard against institutional abuse. It had her name, his signature, and a clause stating that no board vote could override her authority without public disclosure and stakeholder input. That document had never been seen by the current board. It had been filed separately for protection, and now it was in her hands again. That same afternoon, a crowd began to grow outside the hospital. Former nurses, community leaders, retired patients, a local pastor. They stood in quiet protest, refusing to move, holding up copies of the article the hospital had tried to erase. A ripple had become a wave, and though the board still moved behind tinted glass, inside that building they now had to look through windows and see what they had created. Not silence, not fear. Witnesses. In momentum. The pressure had shifted but not disappeared. As the protests outside grew, and her documents began to circulate across legal networks and watchdog groups, the board grew more desperate. They needed a countermove, something bold enough to fracture her growing support. So they turned to someone close. Her attorney, the one who had helped draft her original silent partner filing, the one who knew every clause, every backup, every contingency plan she had in place. For weeks, he had been advising her to remain cautious, to avoid media appearances, to let the documents speak for themselves. She trusted him, until one morning when she received a courtesy call from a paralegal at a different law firm. The voice on the other end was low and hesitant. They informed her that her original attorney had met privately with members of the hospital's board 2 nights earlier and handed over an internal memo that included privileged communications between them. Not long after, a heavily edited video surfaced online. It showed her in the middle of a training session from years earlier, raising her voice to a resident over a misfiled medication report. The clip had been trimmed to exclude context, tone, and resolution. Shared by anonymous accounts, the video was used as evidence that she had a history of instability. Comment sections reopened. The narrative reappeared. People questioned her credibility again. At the same time, her sister received a call from an unfamiliar number asking invasive questions about her mental health history. A neighbor reported, a strange car parked outside their apartment building for 2 nights in a row. On the 3rd night, someone attempted to access her locked mailbox, leaving the hinge bent and the contents gone. It was a coordinated flood of small violations, each one designed not to break her, but to wear her down. She didn't respond publicly. Instead, she documented everything: dates, times, photos, screenshots, witnesses. The final breach came when she received an official notice from the State Board of Nursing, stating her license had been flagged again for review due to new concerns raised by a third party. The complaint referenced behavior patterns and leadership issues with no source cited. She read the letter twice. Then again, she knew the timing wasn't a coincidence. They couldn't remove her from ownership, so they aimed to remove her from the profession. They wanted the headline to shift. Not hospital scandal, but unstable nurse. Not systemic abuse, but personal dysfunction. They wanted her to become noise, but she had already prepared for this. Weeks ago, she had begun working with an outside legal firm specializing in institutional whistleblower protection. She handed over every piece of evidence, including the betrayal by her own counsel. The firm didn't promise victory, they promised visibility. And visibility was what they feared most. Because once seen, their tactics no longer worked in silence. Once named, their power began to unravel. What they had underestimated was not her strength, it was her preparation. And her patience. The courtroom was colder than it needed to be. Not from the temperature, but from the tone. On one side sat members of the hospital board with their legal team flanked by binders and prepared statements. On the other sat a single chair and a simple folder placed quietly in front of her. She didn't bring a team. She didn't need an audience. She brought truth. The judge reviewed both sides' motions. The board argued for continued injunction against her access, citing erratic behavior and reputational damage. Her representative waited patiently, then stood and requested permission to enter into evidence a series of foundational legal documents including the original ownership filings, the silent stakeholder clause, the co-founder affidavit, the protected board recording, and an chain of communication demonstrating deliberate retaliation. Each document had been verified, time-stamped, and supported by third-party testimony. There were no objections, just silence. Then came the binder. It contained the signed, notarized original agreement stating that under violation of mission, her authority could be activated without vote and without delay. The judge asked if this was her signature. She nodded once, asked if she had ever relinquished her position. She answered clearly, never. The judge turned to the board and asked if they had any documentation overriding her stake. They did not. He asked if they had informed stakeholders of the internal emergency vote. They had not. Then he asked why. The woman before him had been denied access to her own institution. The response was a pause, too long to hide. The judge ruled within the hour. Full reinstatement of all authority. Restoration of name and license. Mandated external review of hospital practices. And effective immediately, the termination of every board member who had signed off on the false psychiatric petition. As the gavel hit the bench, the room remained silent. Not a single voice raised. Not a single person left quickly. They stayed in their seats, still calculating how they had lost everything in a matter of minutes. She stood, nodded to the clerk, and walked out without a glance behind her. Outside, the protesters were still there. But this time, they weren't chanting. They stood quiet, watching her descend the courthouse steps. Her steps weren't rushed. Her hands didn't shake. But her presence was different now. Not because of what she had reclaimed, but because of what she had chosen not to destroy. She could have exposed everything in public. She could have brought cameras, declared war, named every lie. But she chose precision. She chose proof. And now, their system had fallen by its own design. The next day, she returned to the hospital not through the employee entrance but through the front doors. She had once been escorted out of in silence. No one stopped her. No one asked questions. The badge scanner beeped once, then turned green. Inside, the walls felt different. Not cleaner, just more honest. The staff looked up as she passed. Some smiled. Some lowered their heads. One nurse whispered, "Thank you," without speaking. She didn't slow her pace. She walked directly to the executive floor, entered the boardroom, and stood at the head of the table. The same chair that had once belonged to the man who tried to erase her was now empty. She didn't sit in it, she stood, then handed a folder to the interim administrator. Inside were 7 signed orders. 1 dissolving all existing board powers until further review. 1 reinstating previously fired staff. 1 transferring all internal ethics enforcement to an independent review body. 1 banning anonymous complaints without evidence. 1 opening patient feedback channels directly to her office. 1 removing private legal counsel from disciplinary authority. And 1 reassigning the security guard who had pulled her badge from her chest to a non-contact custodial role. She left the room without a word. That evening, the hospital issued a statement, not in denial, but in acknowledgement. It didn't name her. It didn't need to. The community already knew. Across the city, her story was told in fragments. A teacher used it in a civics class. A pastor used it in a sermon about integrity. A student cited it in a graduation speech about resilience. Back inside the hospital, she visited the long-term care wing. There, an elderly patient who had been unconscious for days stirred when she entered the room. The patient's daughter stood to the side, clutching her hand. The woman blinked once and smiled faintly. She remembered her, the daughter whispered. "I knew you would come back." Outside, the security guard who had once thrown her out now waited in line for a maintenance ID. He didn't look at her when they crossed paths in the hallway. She paused, looked directly at him, and said nothing. Mercy didn't need a witness. That night she stood at the hospital rooftop alone. The city stretched before her. The lights below weren't blinking. They were steady, like her. The wind moved her coat, but not her stance. Someone had once told her quiet people get walked over, but they were wrong. Quiet people build the roads. Quiet people hold the foundations. Quiet people remember everything. And when they finally decide to speak, no one forgets.